US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has warned that China may soon provide lethal assistance in the form of weapons and ammunition to Russia's war in Ukraine. Beijing has lashed out at what it calls false claims by the United States. Blinken issued the warning on a US talk show blitz after meeting with his counterpart Wang Yi at the Munich Security Conference and again while on a visit to NATO member Turkey.
We are concerned that China is considering supporting Russia's war effort in Ukraine with lethal assistance, something that we're watching very, very closely. As I also said, and as President Biden said, going back many months when the aggression first took place, and he spoke to President Xi Jinping, he told him at that point that there would be real consequences in our own relationship were China to provide lethal assistance to Russia in this aggression against Ukraine, or in a systematic way aid in the evasion of sanctions.
Joining me now is Director of SOAS China Institute at the University of London, Steve Tsang. Welcome to you. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is expected in Moscow today. Yi talked peace in Munich. At the same time, many suspect Beijing may be on the verge of supplying weapons to Russia. Do you think a weapons trade is a possibility?
I would be very surprised if the Chinese government will supply weapon systems or ammunition to Russia, which will trigger secondary sanctions from the Western democracies. With the warning from Antony Blinken, it will be clear to the Chinese sanctions will be triggered, and I don't think they will act on it.
Yeah, if we play it out briefly, though, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken warned that China arming Russia would have serious consequences. What could those consequences be?
Well, those consequences is secondary sanctions. Chinese policy has been very clear from the start of the Russian invasion, and that policy is simply one of declaring neutrality, supporting Putin, and paying no price. Paying no price means not triggering secondary sanctions against China, but anything short of that, the Chinese will provide Russia and support Putin.
You talk about the possible US sanctions or secondary sanctions. How do you think Europe would react? Would it also be in line to sanction China if this goes ahead?
Well, the secondary sanctions is something that was agreed by the United States and the European allies, which was basically the formula for sanctioning Russia, that if China should violate those specific warnings, then I think the risk of China being subjected to sanctions would be significant. And what Antony Blinken has said essentially is to remind the Chinese that would be the case. I suspect he's acting on the intelligence that the US intelligence community have collected and therefore issued these warnings to preempt the risk of China making a mistake, a miscalculation.
Political scientist and director of the SOAS China Institute at the University of London, Steve Tsang, thank you so much.
We can now speak to DW correspondent Rosie Bierschardt, who is in Brussels and following an EU foreign ministers summit there. So we just heard from the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken that China arming Russia would have serious consequences. But what would be a likely reaction from Europe?
Well, it would be a red line in EU-China relations. That is according to the European Union's Foreign Affairs Chief, Josep Borrell, who has been in this building speaking to press, urging, of course, encouraging China not to take this step. Now, he was quite clear. He said that this was not something he had anticipated from China so far. He had heard from China's top diplomat Wang Yi that China is not planning to send weapons to Russia, but he made it clear that that would be a red line. I also spoke to Estonia's foreign minister, who said he was very concerned about such an eventuality of a supply of weapons from China to Russia. And he said China surely wouldn't want to have blood on its hands. Now, when it comes to a reaction, what does that red line translate into? Well, that is where it gets tricky, because we've seen how difficult it's been for the European Union to pursue sanctions against Russia due to those long built-up dependencies. For example, when it comes to relying on Russia in the past, the EU did, for natural gas. Now, EU-China relations are so deep when it comes to trade. So many jobs in Europe are linked to trade with China that this is something which many analysts say could be very difficult. We'll see how this plays out if this were to indeed occur, if China were to supply these weapons, which Beijing says it has no plan to. Of course, it has pushed back on these claims, but certainly a very important geopolitical topic to keep watching, one which we'll keep watching for you from here at this meeting of EU foreign ministers.
And now China's top diplomat Wang Yi has been meeting with multiple European officials over the last couple of days. It's clear that improving relations with the EU is very important to China. But is China a viable partner for the EU when it comes to helping end the war in Ukraine?
Well, China says it wants peace, but of course China and the European Union have taken very different approaches. China has not sanctioned Russia. It's not even given any sort of outright condemnation of Moscow over the invasion of Ukraine. But the fact is it's seen as a very big, important geopolitical actor. So the EU has to keep talking to China about this. At least that's the line from EU officials, and it has been brought up in several EU-China meetings over the past year. But certainly the European Union looking on, I think, with a degree of concern and alarm when it comes to China's ties with Russia and how those could emerge over the coming days. Because as we heard from Aya, as Joe Biden reportedly touching down in Kyiv, well, Wang Yi, China's top diplomat, is reportedly expected in Russia. And China says it is going to come up with its own peace proposals for peace in Ukraine. I think we can expect those will be quite different from Ukraine's ideas of how to achieve peace, and potentially also the EU's ideas of how to achieve peace, which is essentially that Ukraine must win, that Ukraine should decide on its own terms how this war should eventually end. And of course, the war is dragging on, as we see on the ground, still immense suffering, which continues now almost 1 year on.
That was DW's Rosie Bierstadt reporting for us from Brussels. Rosie, thank you so much. We appreciate it.